You thought I was gonna complete the Expedition series, didn't you? Ye of little faith, you. For all their faults, I enjoyed both Conquistador and Viking, so naturally I was very interested in Logical Art's 2022 foray into ancient Rome. And just like the previous two, this one brings its own significant differences, many of them thankfully for the better. In case this is your first encounter with the Expedition series, they're party-based RPGs that mix turn-based combat, strategy, and historical settings that are fairly self-explanatory from their titles. That description barely scratches the surface of why they're fun to play, but the good news is that I've covered the other two already, and now it's time for this one. Shocker, I know. Expeditions Rome puts you in the shoes of a young nobleman whose father mysteriously dies while a member of a rival family is married to your sister. Sensing the danger of your brother-in-law trying to seize your family's wealth, your mother sends you away to Greece for your own protection. So yes, it's still an expedition, but quite a different kind. You're joined on your trip by Cineros, your family's Greek servant, Caeso, a centurion under consul Lucullus's command, the former gladiator Bestia, and Julius Caesar? Okay, I need to step back and address a few things. You know, I just threw a bunch of names at you, some more recognizable than others, without much context, and for once, that's not my amazing script writing at fault, but the game's writing. Heh, finally I can blame someone else. Throughout Expeditions Rome, you'll constantly encounter people, nations, and political or cultural institutions that aren't always explained immediately. The first part of the game is the worst offender. Within 15 minutes, you're bombarded with all sorts of references and left trying to figure out what's going on, as if you're expected to already know the historical backdrop. There are dialogue options that trigger info dumps, but honestly, they're not enough. Even worse, there's no codex, dictionary, or anything where you can read up on who's who and what's what. So if you're not familiar with this period, it can get confusing really fast, and I definitely sympathize. What about the time period, you ask? Okay, I think I'll be making notes and explanations along the way after all. I'm going to spoil quite a bit, but writing is too good and engaging to leave it vague. Plus, it's the only way anything I will say will make any sense, and you've been properly warned by this point. To start off this impromptu history lesson, the first act takes place during what we call the Third Mithridatic War, which started in 73 BC. For context, all three conflicts were about supremacy in Anatolia between the Kingdom of Pontus, ruled by King Mithridates VI, and the Roman Republic. Not the Empire, a very important distinction that's central to the game's story in fact. Lucullus was one of the two Roman consuls that year, and in the game's version of events, he is your benefactor and patron, offering you protection after your father's death. Last but not least, Caesar is introduced as a young, ambitious politician who is not long for this world, as he dies in an ambush from which you escape by the skin of your teeth. Naturally, it's a reference to the cult classic Executive Decision, where action legend Steven Seagal was front and center on the poster, only for the movie to kill him off right at the start of the second act. At least that's how I want to imagine the development of the game to have been. Just let me have this, goddammit. So, as you can see, the game's story is more or less an alt history hub scenario where one of the history's greatest statesmen dies in his 30s, and then we roll the dice over how differently history might unfold. Yes, Jimmy, just like your Game of Thrones. This is one of the game's strong points. By sending Caesar off at the store to buy some milk, they set up an alternate history that gives the developers plenty of flexibility with the facts. For example, the boat right at the start of the game is attacked, in a cheeky reference to Caesar getting captured by pirates, which actually happened 2 years earlier. The previous Expeditions titles also played with quasi-accurate history, but Rome takes it to another level. No surprise here, you're basically cosplaying as Julius Caesar without having to follow his every step like a documentary. That, or I know significantly less about conquistadors or the Viking invasion of British Isles, but you didn't hear that from me. After arriving in Lesbos, you're tasked with performing covert operations behind enemy lines. Basically, the game's excuse to let you roam around with your companions and complete quests, just like you did in Vikings. You're joined by Julius Calidus, a spy who makes the most blatant and obvious attempt to hide the fact that he's actually a woman in disguise. This also marks your first encounter with the game's turn-based combat system. While I think it's solid overall, there's a lot more meat to chew on in later chapters, so I leave it at that for now. But what I won't leave for now is the fact that I have a Patreon page you can support to your heart's content. I also have a Twitter account in which I sometimes post things regarding my activity. With that being said, let's get back to the video. After surviving the earlier ambush, you're promoted by the consul to legatus, a general, and given control of your own legion. This marks a big turning point for the expedition series, as Rome is easily the most strategy-focused entry of the three. For those who don't remember, Conquistador reminded me a lot of the classical Heroes of Might and Magic games, with a set number of movement points you could spend each day while your squad engaged enemy groups on the map. Viking, on the other hand, had you traveling more freely with your companions, with time passing by naturally as you explored. At first glance, Rome's map's traversal feels similar to Viking, but there are some major differences. First of all, the mechanic of periodically setting camp and assigning activities to your party members is no more. I want to say I'm sad to see it gone, mainly for the immersion of seeing your party gather around the fire, but honestly, it had become a repetitive time waster as you progressed, as you weren't really dependent on the resources gained from those activities, which was a big part of the justifications for its existence in the first place. In Rome, your band of merry men travel uninterrupted aside from random events and encounters. These events are quite varied, especially since each chapter brings its own set and the writing does a great job of building the world. So, despite being a key mechanic in the past games, its absence isn't a real loss for the overall experience. The other significant change comes with the Legion mechanic. Separate from your party's adventures, Legio Victrix will be sent to capture new fortifications and take control of map resources, and naturally to fight against Rome's enemies. Your soldiers won't roam freely on the map, instead they can only be sent to the aforementioned landmarks. Showcasing the great mobility Roman legions had, Victrix has only one camp that they can disassemble and reconstruct whenever you send them from one fortification to another. This means it's actually a good strategy to settle your legion close to your party's position when you need to visit the camp, since the legion moves much faster than your party. But even so, there is some element of backtracking, because after capturing a new region, you also need to pacify it, which plenty times involves visiting the camp to send out your praetorians to deal with the issue. The camp management resembles the way Vikings handled the homestead, but instead of using map resources in terms of like X units of wood or Y units of stone when paying for your building upgrades, Rome simply counts the number of each production landmark that you control on the map, such as tanneries, farms, or mines that you can find in every province of the map. What I said about camp activities being gone is only partially true, because every time you visit the Legion's camp, you can assign one of your praetorians to buildings for different effects. Fortunately, it's not vital to have people assigned at all times for all of them, only the workshop is worth keeping staffed without interruptions, since it's the only way to upgrade your stratagems, which are a direct assistance to your Legion's battles. It's nice that praetorians perform the designated tasks for multiple cycles, since it means less babysitting on your end. There's quite a few aspects of Legion and camp management. First of all, you recruit new soldiers from your own pocket, and it's the only way you can rebuild your Legion after heavy losses in combat. But besides soldiers, you also have to recruit centurions to act as commanders on the field during battles, each with their own set of skills and special attributes that enhance your troops' effectiveness on the field. The battles themselves are one of the standout features of the game, so I think it's a good moment to dig into them a bit more. But first, let's temper some expectations. No, the Legion battles aren't the chance to put to the test the hundreds of hours you sank into the Total War games. The short version is that it's a collectible card game with some squares and numbers thrown around. Fucking hell, I'm the anti-marketing guy. That's because each fight consists of 4 phases, each starting with a choice of 1 out of 3 stratagem cards that provide various effects over the key numbers. Besides the number of soldiers, their morale and experience, there are 4 attributes that you and your opponent are juggling with throughout the battle phases with the help of these stratagem cards and the collective skills of your centurions. These attributes have certain points thresholds that generate an effect when it's passed after each phase that can be pretty substantial at some point. They can generate more injuries, they can provide you with more resources at the end of the battle, impact the morale of your soldiers, or even the ability to completely wipe out the enemy army once victorious. See, I'm doing that thing I always do. presenting something really cool in the most fucking boring by the numbers fashion. So let's fix that, shall we? These stratagems have all sorts of effects, but for you, they're really just another immersion layer. You're not clicking on a +1 to defense and siege attributes, you're actually choosing to initiate a flanking maneuver against the enemy lines, or you order your men to reinforce a collapsing part of your front, and your centurions are yelling these orders in Latin for extra artistic flair while you hear the roar of the battle in the background. It does a really great job in making you feel like you're truly commanding a Roman legion, and that feeling carries all the way through to the end of the game. Of course, none of these flowery descriptions actually play out on the screen, because underneath it all it's just a numbers game, and the bigger number always wins. This becomes pretty obvious in the first act. You're never outnumbered, and you're never really at risk of finishing a battle with fewer men than your opponent. Honestly, the only way you might even come close to this is if you invest 0 denarii into replenishing your troops, and even then, I doubt it. We're still in the tutorial phase after all, and these battles are so unchallenging that by the end of it feels like you're just wasting your time. The game tells you there's a risk of losing territories if the enemy marches in while your legion is garrisoned elsewhere, but in practice this never happens. Every time the enemy moves in, you get a warning at least 2 days in advance. That's more than enough time to reposition. And since most attacks happen in recently captured provinces, your legion is usually already close by. Fortunately, there's still plenty for your character and his companions to do in Asia Minor. After gaining control of Legio Victrix, you're tasked with conquering all of Anatolia. Along the way, you'll forge new alliances with the cities like Mysia and investigate how the Greek rebels are getting their supplies. This ultimately reveals that your dear brother-in-law is in cahoots with Mithridates, presenting your first major choice in the game. You can either intercept one of his ships to seize the evidence of his treason, or raid the cave where everything's stockpiled and leave Mithridates' army without supplies. The weight of this decision isn't just about the war's outcome, but also your brother-in-law's fate. If you don't get the evidence, he survives and plays an important role later in the game. But if you present proof of his treason to the Senate, his own brother murders him. Yeah, Vitellius Lurco is actually the game's mastermind behind everything. But we'll get to that. Before you can triumphantly return to Rome though, you've got to besiege Chalcedon, rescue the captured Roman consul, and eliminate Mithridates once and for all. I don't know how to put this gently, but sieges, they suck the life out of you, man. Expeditions Rome has several massive sieges meant to be highlights of the story. In this one, for example, you'll have to split your praetorians into 2 groups, one leading the frontal assault and another sneaking inside to destroy the enemy's siege equipment and free the prisoners. This kicks off a whole series of smaller missions, which I'll describe in painful detail to drive my point home. First, you lead the frontal assault to capture the bridge, only to pull back in a feint once the Greeks take the bait. Not so bad so far. Next, a smaller force sneaks towards the enemy catapults, tasked with destroying as many as possible within 5 turns. The sneak part is a bit convoluted. At first, nobody notices you, but as you move forward, you're spotted by smaller groups, very much like how FireX's XCOM games handled pod activation. The difference is that here, each pod apparently has the eyesight of a blind bat, since they can't see you slaughtering their friends just a few meters away out in the open until you cross some magical trigger spot. This mechanic pops up in a few other missions too, but in this context of a siege, where everyone should be on high alert, it feels especially silly. You're not forced to destroy every catapult, but the more you do, the easier the final assault becomes. Okay, we're getting into more complicated territory, but fair enough, this is the culmination of the entire Asia Minor campaign, so they had to make it feel special. You then return to the main assault group, which faces a heavily barricaded enemy position where you need to wipe out all the enemies, including the enemy general, Archelaus. Okay, I made my own bet with this one, I admit. The man is Mithridates' most trusted general, and I handed him over as part of a prisoner exchange when Lucullus and the Pontus king parlayed earlier. But hey, it's cool that my decision led to this final showdown of the Greek general. Anyway, this section is a complete slog. Every wall is manned by archers, relentlessly peppering your troops, while your guys shuffle through tight mazes, slowly breaking barricades just to escape the kill zone. It's a tough segment, and sure, it makes sense for it to be hard, but I can't deny it's a serious difficulty spike. But nothing compares to what comes next. Not because it's harder, it really isn't that much of a problem. Oh no, this one's just bullshit, convoluted, nonsensical segment. So, you arrive in this tiny courtyard next to the dungeons, tasked with clearing out all the enemies and rescuing the prisoners. Fair enough, right? Well, how about a time limit too? Okay, it can't be that bad, right? But then the console gets executed even if you're standing right outside the door with only one enemy left far away on the wall with one health point left clinging to his dear life. Excuse me? Look, I hate drawing these comparisons, but this segment gives off serious Deus Ex Human Revolution boss fight vibes, totally disconnected from the rest of the game's pacing and design. Sure, if you play it optimally, it can be done easily, but the point still stands. So, yay, you finally rescue Console Kota, the day saved. What? Another big brawl where you have to kill everyone? With both of your groups reunited but starting in completely different parts of the city? Only then do you finally get to sit down and collect your laurels. If you think listening to me break all this down is exhausting, keep in mind that it took me close to 2 hours and a half of gameplay from start to finish. And this comes on top of a pretty long first act that, by the way, still isn't over. Yep, there's still one final segment left, the return to Rome. Now, don't mistake me for still complaining when I say that, because the Rome segments, I actually enjoy them quite a lot. For some historical context, in the Roman Republic, a victorious legatus had to disband his legion before re-entering the Italian peninsula, since armed soldiers weren't allowed inside. The symbolic line where this transition from military to civilian life took place was at the crossing of the river Rubicon. Yeah, nothing important ever happens there, surely. I'm a big fan of the Rome segments. Not only they're a neat way to wrap up the events of each chapter, but man do they benefit from the game's writing. Not just the one involving the progression of the main story, but especially when it comes to your companions and, to a lesser extent, your family. Okay, more of the companions actually, but let me explain. The stakes for your character are deeply personal. Your father was murdered, and your sister is basically a prisoner in a political marriage to the family of his assassin. But despite that setup, your mother isn't much of a presence. She spends most of her screen time worrying about you, about your sister, and that's about it. Aside from being the punchline for multiple "she's a horrible cook" jokes, she mainly exists to show you how your average aristocratic Roman woman might think and behave. And that's as far as it goes. Your sister fares even worse. If her husband dies, she effectively disappears from the story. No, seriously, she might as well have died alongside your father because she has zero impact afterwards. It's a real shame considering how personal your conflict with the antagonist is. You'd expect these characters to play a much bigger role than they do. Your companions, on the other hand, are a whole different story. All 5 of them are fantastic characters with rich interactions and incredibly engaging personal quests. Take Cineros, your family's servant and, in many ways, a father figure to the protagonist. He is well educated and offers wise counsel on matters of virtue, honor and morality. His character quest takes place in Asia Minor, where he unexpectedly reunites with an old adversary from his days as a Pancration wrestler, who accuses him of being a cheat and stealing the tournament trophy before their match. It's a bombshell moment, especially since up until then, Cineros comes across as the classic wise and honorable old man. Suddenly, he's a man with a complicated past and flaws, and it's fantastic. Then there's Caeso, a loyal centurion and the living embodiment of what a Roman legionary should be: steadfast, disciplined, and honorable. His entire life revolves around the legion, to the point where his downtime in Rome is mostly spent drinking and wenching until the next campaign begins. That is, until a woman shows up claiming he's the father of her child, something that completely rattles him, especially since he drinks so much he generally can't tell if it's true or not, and this uncertainty follows him into the next campaign. Julia is more or less a tomboy who's fed up with the Roman society being tomboy-phobic. It's a pretty tired cliche, if I'm being honest, and she's probably the least enjoyable companion overall. That being said, her constant efforts to conceal her identity and her reluctance to be in Rome creates a strong aura aura of mystery that keeps you wanting to find out more about her. She's also one of the most pragmatic and distrusting members of your party, which makes sense considering she's more or less a spy. Bestia Tabat might be just the most interesting party member of the bunch. A prolific gladiator turned soldier, he views warfare as a spectacle, while someone like Caeso sees virtue as the foundation of honor. For Bestia, it's victory and raw ability that earn respect. So it's not a surprise that whenever violence is on the table, he's the first to suggest it, no matter how bad the odds are. But there's a great twist to him. He's absolutely obsessed with being mentored by Cineros in the ways of philosophy. This leads to some hilarious exchanges where Bestia takes the teachings completely to heart, only to use them as the most intellectually rigorous justification for more violence, all while poor Cineros is left stumbling over his words, desperately trying to steer his student towards a more enlightened outlook on life. The last companion you meet is Deianira, a Scythian woman who was captured and forced into gladiatorial combat before being freed by the main character. While she's a highly capable fighter in her own right, she doesn't share Bestia's bloodthirsty enthusiasm. She's quite a complex character, but at this stage, she's completely unwilling to discuss her past. The only thing you have going for you is her curiosity about Rome. She's excited to see it for herself and more than happy to accept your invitation to stay at your villa. Okay, I lied when I said the companions would only be a short parenthesis. Haven't you learned by now not to trust me on that? Your time in Rome is spent handling family business, sure, but also climbing the political ladder. Under Lucullus's wing, you're introduced to the city's big names, including renowned orators like Cato and Cicero, who feature several intellectually stimulating exchanges, which are very much worth your time. But ultimately, the real highlight is the Senate meeting, where the outcomes of your campaign are officially presented. As I mentioned earlier, because I chose to get evidence to prove that the brother-in-law was committing treason, Vitellius Lurco takes everyone by surprise after theatrically announcing he murdered his traitorous brother to protect the honor of the Republic and other pathetic nonsense. Not only does he use the moment to bask in sympathy and admiration for supposedly putting Rome's interest above his own family, but it also reveals just how deranged and dangerous he really is. Terrific villain to face. Fortunately, with Lucullus still around, there's no need to worry about further assassination attempts on you or on your loved ones. This lasts for a few years, until suddenly, Lurco wants to meet you in a suspiciously isolated alley. In what is surely an astonishing coincidence, a gang of thugs show up shortly after, clearly looking to kill you. And if that wasn't enough to make the alarm bells deafening by now, Lucullus, now proconsul in Egypt, sends word asking you to reform Legio Victrix and meet him in Africa to stop some vague but ominous plan Lurco has to eliminate all of his enemies, including yourself. Well, fucking gee, that would've been super helpful before I went poking around the back alleys for you. Unfortunately, your arrival in Egypt lands you in front of the proconsul's bloodied corpse, and also in realization of one of the game's most frustrating features, which is not saving any of your party's equipment. Now, this wouldn't normally be a big deal, but Rome loves forcing you to unequip everything during major story beats, including every visit to Rome and any mission involving disguises. I don't actually mind the undercover missions, they're fun honestly, but having to manually reassign every piece of armor and every weapon afterwards is a huge pain in the ass, especially when the inventory UI isn't exactly what I'd call pleasant. More on that later, of course. Back to the story, just as you're processing the death of your patron, you're visited by Lunia the Golden Wolf, a tribal elder sent by Cleopatra to warn Lucullus of the danger to his life. This quickly pulls you into the conflict between Cleopatra and her brother/husband Ptolemy. Add in the revelation that Ptolemy and Lurco were involved in illegal dealings and likely had Lucullus killed to cover their tracks, and it's obvious by now an Egyptian campaign is in order. Those of you that are a bit more observant will realize that this isn't the same order as Caesar's campaigns, but we're knee-deep into the alt history by now, so let's just roll with it and enjoy the ride. There's one big twist in this campaign though. You're forced to raise the second legion if you want to have any chance of defeating the pharaoh. To do so, you'll first have to mingle with the tribal politics of the Nasamones and gather enough allies to recruit Berbers in your legion. That's of course easier said than done, since some of the influential elders are openly extremely hostile to you and refuse any form of collaboration. Therefore, this leads up to, and you can't imagine how happy I am to say it, another siege! More bullshit, fuck yes! But before I jump into that can of worms, let's jump a bit into how combat and equipment works in Expeditions Rome. There is totally no reason for why I picked this moment to bring it up, don't worry about it, kitten. So, the turn-based combat is more or less the same as it was in Vikings. Each character class has 3 ability trees from which you can pick skills every time they level up, and their types of weapons and armor they can use. What brings some spice into the combat is that there are also a bunch of weapon attack skills that are entirely dependent on the weapon being used. It's not just a gladius or an Egyptian sword can be different, but that even 2 weapons of the same type can have different attack skills attached to them. It's a neat way to make weapons more varied and provide significantly more tactical options, while also giving you more reasons to choose one outside of looking at its damage. This applies particularly in the first part of the game, but it does highlight the issues of how inventory works. First of all, you've got all the tools to look at and compare to items, but the experience is still a frustrating mess. The inventory doesn't give you much useful information at a glance, and what it does give you can be misleading. See these arrows? These indicate weapons that deal more or less damage than one currently equipped. That's a really neat feature, but the information itself is deceptive because each weapon can have a bazillion different stats that aren't considered. One bow might deal 1 less damage than another, but also have higher accuracy and crit chance. Meanwhile, the better one might have none of those and be objectively worse in every other way, despite the arrow pointing up. So you end up with maybe dozens of nearly identical weapons that you have to painstakingly compare to find the best option. Remember my earlier rant about losing all your gear after missions that force you into disguises or alternative equipment sets? Yeah, now you can see why that's such a pain in the ass. Fortunately, this becomes less of a problem over time as you begin to collect unique items, which are much easier to identify and remember. Still, during the first half of the game, your inventory will be swamped with generic items that have identical names and no way to mark or favorite them. And even though crafting is technically an option, it's kind of pointless after some point. Once unique items start rolling in, there's no crafted gear that can really compete with what you'll eventually loot. Ah yes, the game still has a crafting mechanic. It's neat, especially useful for creating limited use items like bandages or pila, but man does it come bundled with the boring as fuck dismantling system. Loot a bunch of items you don't need? Great, now you get to dismantle them one by one, complete with an animation that's slow for no good reason. That's if you even know the items you just picked up are worse than what you already have. If you don't have the entire contents of your inventory memorized, tough shit. You'll be bouncing back and forth, comparing stats, then returning to the crafting screen again and again. Crafting also relies on recipes you collect as you progress through the game. That part is fine, except for the fact that when you do find a recipe, you have to manually go through each one to learn it. And yes, it uses the same long, drawn-out animation as dismantling. Why? Who knows? It makes no sense because unlike weapons, you can't do anything else with recipes besides reading them. Just let me learn them instantly and move on with my life instead of me finding this mechanic exists around the half point of the game and then waste 15 minutes trying to manually learn all of them. Who the fuck thought this out? Okay, now that we're done with yet another small parenthesis, let's get back to the siege. Shosh. Can I go back shitting on the inventory, please? It starts with the frontal assault, which is a straightforward meat grinder alongside a small group of people that's been sent to burn the 2 bridges your enemies could use to send reinforcements. The second is yet another major source of annoyance due to how bullshit is being set up. You're thrown in an arena facing overwhelming groups of enemies that are more or less a distraction from the actual objective, the bridges, which you have a limited number of turns before you can burn them. This is one of those segments that either a nightmare or an effortless breeze, and you won't know which until it's too late to prepare for it. Remember how weapons have unique attack skills? Well, some bows have flaming arrows, which are basically an instant win for any mission involving fire. Speaking of which, lighting and extinguishing fires is actually one of the cooler mechanics of the game. Fire spreads out organically between flammable objects, and having access to water can significantly affect combat. Flames act as a soft barrier that restrict movement, which makes for some clever tactics. But yeah, in this mission, of course I didn't bring an archer with flaming arrows, so I had to send my fastest guy sprinting across the map, throw a torch at one bridge, grab another torch from the map, and then hope I could light the second bridge before getting swarmed by a small army. And the only reason this even worked is because I happened to have a torch equipped, because you can't grab multiple items from the same stack with one character, and that character happened to be from the class that allows him to avoid triggering reaction attacks when zipping past enemy soldiers. An absolutely dreadful experience. For those keeping track, this siege took another 2 hours of my life, by the way. God! With Legio Afrorum now formed, you're finally in a much better position to handle this act's map. That's partly because the map itself is quite a bit larger, but also because enemy armies are now much more evenly matched with yours. And thank God for that. It actually made me stop thinking the war mechanic was tacked on. Since you no longer have the luxury of fully reinforcing both legions due to your not-so-huge treasury, you're forced to play it smarter and take a more methodical step-by-step approach across the region. Depending on the situation, I'd send the Legio Victrix, which had higher morale and better experience, into the tougher fights, and then use Legio Afrorum to clean up the easier regions and secure resource points. Sometimes I'd leapfrog between them, alternating which legion would get its manpower replenished with my hard-earned denarii. Around this point, your legion camp development really kicks into full gear. You'll be upgrading stratagems, improving equipment, and trying to squeeze every last advantage out of your setup. And you know what? Clearing out the map in this act is actually pretty fun. A far cry from how dull it felt during the last act. The story also advances nicely. You're faced with the fact that there are spies sent by a mysterious Legio Wixi, that's how it's written, okay, because it's pretty confusing when I just say it, to throw a wrench into your plans. And I doubt it's a shock to anyone that it didn't take long to connect them to Lurko. The proof you have is a Roman accountant kept within the Pharaoh's palace that's willing to testify in front of the Senate if you free him. And since diplomacy with the Pharaoh was never really in the cards, it's time for, you guessed it, another siege. But this time it turns out to be one of the best ones in the game. You get 2 stages of combat in the royal palace's courtyard, leading up to a final showdown in the throne room. And that last fight, an absolute chaos which I love to bits. Sure, the layout has plenty of narrow passageways where you'd think you could choke the enemy, but then the Pharaoh's guards show up with gas bombs that obscure vision and induce panic in anyone standing in the cloud. Your formation breaks, order collapses, and the battle turns into a frantic scramble to survive. But just as things seemed hopeless, Lurko's Praetorian Guard shows up to save your skin. Afterwards, you're faced with another series of major decisions, as you can either kill or capture the Pharaoh, and afterwards you've got the possibility to either kill Cleopatra, Golden Wolf, or both. But it really doesn't matter all too much, since the accountant you were relying on is found dead, leaving the conclusion of this campaign as a big loss for yourself. Not only were you unable to prevent Lucullus's death, but in trying to expose Lurko's alliance with the Pharaoh, you unwillingly gave him the perfect stage to swoop in as a supposed savior, sending his Praetorian Guard to rescue a Roman general on the brink of defeat. He's rewarded with a nomination as consul, and just to really drive the nail in, your party begins debating whether or not disbanding the legion before crossing the Rubicon is the way to stop him from being one step ahead of you. I might have heard that one before.
Makes us predictable. This is how Lurko always wins. He knows what our possible moves are, so he prepares himself accordingly. He plans for both outcomes and controls the result either way. Now, consider the results of a commander crossing the Rubicon with his legion, ignoring the ancient law and the tradition. Certainly not.
Otherwise, your visit in Rome wraps up the rest of your companion's quests. Bestia already did in Africa after discovering his long-lost sister, from which he got separated when they were sold into slavery during their childhoods. I already said he's my favorite companion, and that's in part because the way he faces his emotional moment is the best out of the companion quests. Looking for Cineros' guidance, almost as a child asking help from his father, he asks himself what to do after he realizes that his sister, who was blinded by her master, is unable to recognize Bestia and even runs away from your camp after she was rescued by your party. It's a pretty sad conclusion, with the silver lining being that his development as a person when facing his moral and philosophical dilemma is very satisfying to witness. Kaeso's situation is more straightforward. He wants to free the mother of his child from servitude, but her master demands the protagonist's presence since he's a jealous rival to his family's wine business. Since his idea of negotiation was to demand over half of the family's vineyards, I decided the best course of action was to attempt to deceive him by blackmailing with knowledge I pretended to have over the man's shady dealings. It works, and while Kaeso is deeply grateful, he is also left shaken by the moral compromise he witnessed, questioning his own ideals and how much the ends justify the means. Yulia Kaleda's past reluctance to set foot in Rome is finally explained when Kikero himself asks you to meet both of them in a secluded location. It turns out that she was previously married until her husband had a sudden case of dying, and her family attempted to use the murder accusation as a way to force her into another marriage with some rich nobleman. This would have been a very interesting trial to witness, but unfortunately, by romancing her, I was able to marry her right there and then, therefore skipping the need of a trial in the end. Who knew that love was such an efficient legal defense? Eat shit, Saul Goodman! And finally, Dayanara's tragic past is revealed the moment she visits an underground alcohol enjoyers association to confront the man that murdered her sister. And by confront, I mean kill. And by kill, I actually mean murder everyone present in a fit of blind rage. Hey, that's a cool Axis constellation, I'll take it. She goes on to describe how guilty she feels for getting her sister in harm's way, and goes as far as turning herself to prison and waiting to be executed over what she did. As you go to free her, the conversation touches on a lot of spiritual elements as she tries to process the consequences of her actions, and it's another moment of good writing and character development. With this being out of the way, a few years pass, seemingly without incident. You're in a tavern, having a nice cup of wine with Kaeso and Cineros, talking about all kinds of stuff you talk when going out for drinks with your mates. A little bit about family, about life, about your family's wine business, past adventures, and then the Gauls attack. No, fucking really, an entire Gaulish army is in the middle of the streets massacring Romans and burning the whole place down. Jesus Christ, is this how the third act starts? Anyway, you run for your villa where the Gauls are very conveniently there to kill your family specifically. Your sister ends up dead, rip my beloved sister with whom I exchanged 2 minutes of dialogue, and it's pretty clear that this has Lurko written all over it. I think there were more subtle ways to go about it, but who the fuck am I to say, huh? Unfortunately, your hands are tied. Lurko isn't just a consul now, he's been granted the title of dictator. That gives him absolute power until the current crisis ends, and you're directly under his control. Therefore, you helplessly watch him force the Senate into declaring war on Gaul despite his way too visible enthusiasm over this. To make matters worse, you end up having to serve as a legate under his command, which is about as reassuring as being a fly in the middle of a spider's web. From what I can tell, quite a few players consider the Gaul chapter to be the weakest part of the game, and I honestly don't blame them. It's a shame because this act features the most challenging Legion battles so far, and it finally becomes crucial to upgrade your full stratagem deck to counter the increasingly dangerous enemy tactics. It also becomes a lot more important to minimize your own losses while maximizing the enemies, since the gap between your Legion and the hordes the Gauls throw at you is razor thin. One mechanic I haven't talked about yet is how defeated enemy troops don't just disappear. If they survive, they retreat and become part of future enemy armies you'll face later on. But if you build up enough artillery points during a battle, the enemy force completely scatters, meaning you won't have to deal with those troops again. It's a great incentive to specialize in artillery and wipe them off the map for good, but also implies compromising sacrificing other aspects that can also turn out costly if you ignore them. In this sense, the third act stretched my resources the most, and honestly, it felt the closest to what war should have felt throughout the entire game. I should mention that throughout the entire game, I was not even once under threat of losing a battle, which is a shame, but on the other hand, I kinda get it. I don't think it would have been an enjoyable experience to have the story's progress blocked every time your army wasn't able to win a battle, especially since the game is already pretty lengthy to go through anyway. But there's a caveat to this. Besides marching on the enemy fortifications to capture a region and pacifying it with either a legion march or a full-blown combat segment of your Praetorians, most of the time spent by your legions will be in their trips to capture the map resources needed to upgrade your camp. Unfortunately, if you were diligent enough in the other two campaigns and took control of the entirety of the maps, you will now literally suffer from success by having no reason to take anything else besides the quarries that build roads for faster map movement. You can breeze through Gaul like nobody's business. Ironically, the only thing stopping you is the previously mentioned stretching of resources, since you need to periodically replenish your legions more often. Then there's the story part, which is less meaty than in the other acts. In short, you're caught in an endless series of traps set up by Lurko that you can't make any sense of, all while being forced to invade Gaul on his orders despite being fairly certain he is the one who orchestrated the attack on Rome in the first place. Every assignment you're given feels like a setup. For example, the time Lurko tells you to attack the Helvetii from behind so he can lead the frontal assault, only for you to end up stranded behind enemy lines with zero reinforcements because his legion has conveniently vanished from the region. Thankfully, you get some begrudging assistance from King Vercingetorix, who is quite understandably highly suspicious of your motives. Still, he is willing to investigate who actually ordered the Gauls to attack Rome. But until he comes back with an answer, Lurko orders you to seek support from the Aedui tribe, with which he already has amicable relations. Initially, this arrangement seems advantageous until, like clockwork, they trigger a devastating ambush that fells your entire party. But then, for some reason, Lurko and his Praetorian guards swoop in and kill the Gauls to rescue you from the brink of death. See, I've already complained about the game throwing a bunch of names and terms at you early in the game without enough explanations, but now we've moved on to the plot and its twists becoming convoluted for the sake of it. Throughout the story, it's established that Lurko is an extremely calculated man, someone who seeks power at all costs and goes to sociopathic lengths to achieve his goals. He's made repeated attempts to have you and your family killed, presumably to cover his shady and treasonous dealings with Rome's enemies. There are multiple moments in the story where your life was nearly ended because of his involvement, some more brazen than the others, and yet, in the most convenient of them all, he decides to save you and nurse you back to health for reasons that basically nobody can understand, as he won't even try to explain. No, I'm sorry, it's just honorable to not let Romans die at the hand of barbarians is not good enough of a justification. Think about it, this is a man who's a consul with dictatorial powers, supposedly leading a campaign to eliminate the Gallic threat, and he brings you along because your military pedigree makes you a valuable asset while also making himself look like a shrewd politician that's willing to compromise with his rivals. He then conveniently retreats from a battle he ordered you to commit to, clearly hoping you'll be wiped out by the surrounding Gallic army. Then, when that doesn't work, he sets you up to be ambushed with no hopes to escape, in which he takes advantage to kill two Gallic chieftains and then somehow decides to not leave you for dead. Are you fucking kidding me? That's the judgment call of the villain that's obviously ruthless and willing to leave a trail of corpses behind to achieve power? This man was 2 steps ahead of me throughout the entire story. The man's such a menacing villain, and yet in the darkest moment of your rivalry, he ends up like this? So damn frustrating. It's moments like these that make me think that this chapter was rushed. The conspiracies and twists were always part of the game's fabric, but here they start to feel nonsensical, driven more by plot convenience than logic. And that's a double shame because Caesar's real campaigning goal, at least what he described in his own account, is considered the masterpiece of military strategy. I suspect that's the main reason the developers made the decision for this campaign to come after Egypt, but in the end it does not matter because it's less detailed, less interesting, and weaker plot progression than anything that came before with. And with all your companion storylines already wrapped up, it doesn't even have that to fall back on. The silver lining, where King Getorix came through, he uncovered that the Gauls who attacked Rome were hired by Legio Vixi on Lurko's behalf, operating out of Elysia, the Gallic capital. When you track them down, you manage to capture their leader, who's surprisingly easier to persuade into testifying against his former employer, provided he gets to work for you afterwards. The catch? Where King Getorix wants to stop the Roman invasion first and foremost, so he takes custody of the prisoner until you deliver on that promise. Because this man is actually smart, and you see that, Lurko, was that hard? But since you've got your hands tied, you guessed it, it's fucking siege time! Is it long? Yes indeed. Does it have bullshit? Do we really need to ask? But at least this stage yourself and your companions are leveled and geared up to the max, so the fights themselves flow easier than expected. It all culminates with a three-way battle between yourself, with King Getorix's guards, and Lurkor's Praetorians that naturally are there to get rid of the valuable prisoner. It's a shame that there aren't more battles with this kind of setup, because it's actually pretty damn fun to go out all on this madness of a skirmish. But in the end, I chose to spare the Gallic king and let him go because, after all, he wasn't the reason I came to Gaul in the first place. I'm actually respecting the RP from the concept of RPG for a change. With Lurko's chief spy in custody, it's time to return to Rome and be done with it. As we once more reach the Rubicon, the game's most pivotal decision is upon us. It shouldn't take much of a guess what it is. After all, at the end of the last act, the idea of crossing the Rubicon with your legion was hinted with about as much subtlety as a marching legion. In reality, Caesar faced the decision to cross the Rubicon because, well, the Roman legal bureaucracy. As the game frequently reminds you, any commander must relinquish their military role before entering Rome. For Caesar, that meant giving up his proconsulship, and with it, his legal immunity. This was a problem because he desperately wanted to run for consul again to pass legislation that would cement his domination over Roman politics. But to announce his candidacy, he had to physically show up at the Senate since his sly attempts to submit his candidacy in absentia was blocked by his rivals in Senate. And the second he gave up his immunity, he would have been buried under the legal prosecutions for the plethora of illegalities he committed during his first term as consul. If you think this situation was convoluted, just be aware that there are plenty more details I left out. But in short, Caesar's crossing was due to his own personal ambition and the descent of Roman politics into gridlocked rivalries. But even if the concept of crossing the Rubicon is associated with his decision to march against Pompey and the Roman Senate, he was not the first to do so. Less than 40 years before him, Sulla had done the same thing in order to save his own political career. Fun connection! The First Mithridatic War, which took place a decade before the third we got to be part of in the Greek chapter, ended up with a deal between Sulla and King Mithridates because the former planned to go back to Italy and march on Rome to crush his political opponents, which he did via brutal and bloody dictatorship. Even if the belief that Caesar eroded the foundation of the Roman Republic is pretty widespread, the reality is that it was already on its last legs regardless of his plans. This is why I really appreciate having this choice in the game instead of railroading you into crossing the Rubicon. It doesn't show this violation of old traditions as something determined by a singular person's will, but as an inevitability of a decaying institution. At the same time, the choice itself is in your hands. In other words, it's the personal responsibility of those breaking tradition instead of them being helpless victims of deeper processes. Said processes did exist and had an impact, but at the end of the day, processes are determined by individuals that choose in which way of the current they swim. They don't just happen on their own. In the game, Lurko is the embodiment of the Republic's wrecking ball, but in a very dissimilar fashion. He does share the traits of being ambitious and intelligent, but first and foremost, he's ideologically driven to the extent of being entirely possessed by his vision of a Rome reborn in his fashion. It's not just that he desires power, but he has profound moral objections over the way Roman society is shaped. Your choice to attack Rome or not has a multitude of separate outcomes depending on the rest of the choices you've made in past acts, but they certainly are satisfactory to go through. I already spoiled plenty storyline elements already, so I have the decency to refrain at least in regards of the potential endings you can achieve. What I can say is that in all the paths I chose across several tries, the characters and the writing wrap up very nicely, and neither choice made me feel that one is worse than the other, each of them providing plenty of drama to savor. I'm happy that they did not skimp on this aspect of the game, because if it was done in a similar way to the rest of the Gaul chapter, it would have sunk a lot of the enjoyment I had exploring Expedition Rome's story. Because yes, throughout my long time spent in its company, I was close to being the game's prisoner due to how much it grabbed my attention. There are plenty of aspects which I can point out as improvements compared to the previous Expeditions titles. But for me, the most significant was by far the writing and everything it derives from it. Conquistador was okay in this aspect, while Viking had good improvements, but Rome is such an impressive evolution that it would be very hard for me to ever go back to either of the first two and enjoy them the same way I did back when I first played them. In a sea of strategies and city builders, Expeditions Rome stands out as one of the few classical Rome story-driven titles and sets up a very fine standard for others to match. As usual, thanks to everyone for watching this video. Click the buttons, subscribe, give your thoughts, and share this with your like-minded fellows. And until next time, cheers!